Well, first of all, I want to say to the members of this congregation that having had a chance to get to know just a little bit Pastor Rush in the last couple of days, that you are really lucky to have someone with such a wonderful spirit and energy leading your church. And I also just want to say thank you for the pastoral care that you provided in Sis and our family over these last days. Thank you. So, I have a lot to say. When you live to be 99, there's a lot to talk about. So, bear with me. But here we are, at that day we all knew was coming, but had hoped would never get here. When I saw my Aunt Sis at the family reunion in July, I knew very well it might be the last time that I saw her. But like all of us, I had hoped that she would make it to her 100th birthday and that I would see her again at that party. So while not to see her again feels incredibly sad, I also feel like at this time, it's hard not to see her life as a celebration. A celebration of someone who brought so much to our lives and whose life was so fully lived. Irene Augusta Fryer, previously Lindahl, was born on February 24th in 1915. She was the first of 5 children born to Hattie Mae Arndt and Ernst W. Lindahl. She was preceded in death by her brothers Elwood, Bud, Gordon, Gore, Raymond, Ray, and she's survived by her one sister, Dolores, Dee, who's here today. Irene was married to Robert Fryer for 59 years prior to his death in 1999. She's also survived by her daughter, Nancy Weiss, her son-in-law, Craig Weiss, her granddaughter, Meredith Weiss, and the grandson-in-law, Santino White, and a host of nieces and nephews and grandnieces and nephews. Irene died on December 4, 2014, 2 months shy of her 100th birthday. Well, that is the obituary version of her life, but as we all know, there was so much more. Just to provide some context to the longevity of her life, I share with you these facts. She was born in 1915, 5 years before women had the right to vote in this country. 20 years before airplanes began to be used regularly for commercial flight. The first stop sign in the United States appeared that year in 1915 in none other than Detroit, Michigan. She grew up in a rural farmhouse that did not have electricity or indoor plumbing until after she left home in the mid-1940s. And in my childhood, I still remember the outhouse that she would have used, sitting about 50 yards from the farmhouse. And it would still be used on occasion when I was a kid, on those times when the electricity went out and the plumbing backed up. And it was always a cold trip. Irene's life spanned a period of incredible change in this country. She grew up in a rural 3-bedroom farmhouse in Spinks Corners, Michigan. The family was not wealthy, but they were not poor either. They had what they needed: a warm farmhouse, 40 acres of land, and each other. Sis witnessed the transition of the farm from using horses to plow and till to using the tractor. But to really understand Aunt Sis, you have to understand her name. And I don't mean the name Irene. For Irene was always known to her family as Sis, or to her nieces and nephews as Aunt Sis. I was in high school before I realized that Sis was not actually her name. But it described who she was. She was the older sister to 4 younger siblings, and she took that job very seriously. This became particularly important after their father died in 1940 at the age of 52. At that point, Dee and Ray were just 11 and 9 years old, and Sis's role in their life became even more important. When Dee, at the age of 4 years old, was asked to sing in a program at the school, she was accompanied by Sis on the piano. And that was the beginning of many years of performing together at school and at church. She was 25 when her father died, and she had married Bob in June of that same year, and they moved to Roseville, Michigan. Despite living fairly far away, visits to the farm were frequent, and weekly phone calls became the norm. She called her brothers and sister regularly throughout her life. You could set your clock to the 9 o'clock phone call that occurred every Saturday morning between Sis and her sister Dee. The whole family knew that you didn't mess with that 9 o'clock phone call. If she was a loyal sister, she was a staunchly loyal grandmother. As Meredith said, she was always my best friend. We talked every day on the telephone at 2:18 when I got out of school. Hardly a week would go by without Meredith seeing her grandmother. And at the hospital, Meredith told me the story later, very sweet. At the hospital, she was going through her grandma's wallet, taking out pictures of the family to show her when she was there. And there was a picture missing, a picture of Meredith, which Meredith couldn't understand because her grandma always had that picture. After Irene died, she found it on the table next to where she always sat. And she had been looking at it right up to the very end. So, Sis and Bob and Nancy never missed a holiday, a Thanksgiving, a Christmas on the farm, unless the weather was particularly daunting. I wish I could fully capture for the younger members of our family what those holidays were like. The farmhouse sat back off of, it was Napier Avenue, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sat back off of Napier Avenue, small and very unassuming. A barn was tucked in behind the house. And at Christmas, there was always a tree with those old-fashioned light bulbs on it, the big ones, although they weren't old-fashioned. Yeah. And it had lots of incredible ornaments of different shapes and sizes. And one by one, each sibling and their families would arrive. First, usually Gorn Bud from St. Joe, Dee from Niles, and traveling the furthest from Detroit was Ray and Sis. And as each arrived, the tree would fill up with presents until they extended like 6 feet out from the tree. Grandma would have prepared a big meal, usually creamed herring and saltafish, which was a nod to our Swedish heritage. I don't know where that came from. It was kind of a Norman Rockwell painting. And it was that, at least in my memory. But it was also more. Because Uncle Bob and Uncle Gore would be worried about the weather for the trip home. And Uncle Ray would be doubled over in the dining room for having drunk too much apple cider yet again. The family rule was to open presents one at a time so that we could, sort of cherish the opening, right? Although to the kids, that was the last thing on our mind. And the process was made worse because Nancy insisted on opening her presents one piece of cake at a time. So it went on and on and on until even the kids were exhausted. But Aunt Sis, she loved it all, from the opening of the first present to the last. She was an elementary school teacher, which she did for 6 or 7 years. Perhaps the most important thing that came out of that time was her husband, Bob. He was a principal of a school, she a school teacher. Turns out they lived on farms about 10 miles apart. And when they first started to court, Bob showed up one day with a chicken on the running board of his car. Bob hadn't noticed. Uncle Bud saw it. And he asked Bob about the chicken. Bob replied, "Well, that must be your chicken. Jumped up on my car." Uncle Bud said, "That's a Rhode Island Red. We don't have Rhode Island Reds on this farm." Turned out that chicken had hitched a ride all the way from the Fryer farm to the Lindahl farm. And that's right where that chicken stayed. Well, I've talked about Aunt Sis being a loving sister, but she also was a prankster. And that was probably the source of the mischievous sparkle in her eye. There is a story of the time when she put a horse harness on her brother's, Bud's, head, and then proceeded to use some old barn paint to paint his head red. So when you took off the harness, there was the outline of that harness on his head. Now, you can imagine her parents' dismay when they next saw Bud. I always thought that's why Bud was bald on the top. She also had a stubborn streak. But then I think you have to be a little bit stubborn to live to 99 and still be living in your own home. When the discussion came up to perhaps move to a place where she could have some assistance, she was having nothing to do with it. Which leads to situations like last winter, when her dog, Mac, was out doing his business after one of those snowfalls you had here. Now, pugs are not renowned for their lengthy legs. And Mac got stuck in a snowdrift. It probably didn't help that Aunt Sis tended to overfeed her pugs. So that in addition to short legs, her dogs were known for their exceptional size. So there was Mac stuck in a snowdrift. And when Aunt Sis, at the age of 98, went out to rescue him, she got stuck in the snowdrift right beside him. Now, for most people, you might think that would start them to thinking about, maybe I shouldn't be living at home alone. But not Aunt Sis. Even to the end, last Sunday when Craig, who could not have been a better son-in-law to her, called and realized that she wasn't doing well, he asked her to push her lifeline button, to which she responded, "I will not." She wanted to go out on her own terms, which is what she did. But Aunt Sis was first and foremost a loving mother. Once Nancy was born, that relationship became her priority. Present at every school function, organ recital, and childhood activity, it began a relationship of 63 years with hardly a week going by in which they did not see each other. It's always our closest relationships where we let people see all of who we are, the good, the bad, and the ugly.